Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online program titled The White Whale, Moby-Dick Illustrated. Tonight's program is the latest installment of the Windle-Loker lecture series on the history of the illustrated book. It is co-presented and co-hosted by the American Trust for the British Library. I personally want to thank you all for joining us here in the club rooms, our new club rooms, and for joining us online this evening. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you and kind of get this program started this evening. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, I ask you to consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to find out more about the book club, to join the book club, or to donate. Thanks to the generosity of John Windle and Chris Loker, the book club is able to host this annual lecture series on the illustrated book. Tonight's lecture by Declan Kiely includes a survey of some of the famous and lesser known illustrated editions, artist books, and other visual interpretations of Moby-Dick. It is certain to be a terrific presentation, and I hope you will join me in thanking Chris and John for their support. Take a bow. So in terms of the logistics for tonight's program, we will have a presentation by our speaker, and then we will have a Q&A session. If you have questions or comments for our speaker or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom, or you can hold your question till the top of the hour if you're here in the club rooms, and we will curate questions from you here in the club rooms and from the audience on Zoom. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce author, antiquarian bookseller, longtime Book Club of California member, and a good friend, Chris Loker. Please join me in giving Chris a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Hope you all can hear me okay. I am delighted to be here. Both my husband, John Windle, and I, John, a long-time member of the book club, we are very dedicated to books, and in particular to illustrated books. And that's the reason we have wanted to have this Windle-Loker lecture series. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who is very well known in the world of books and someone I consider a very good friend. Our presenter is Declan Kiely. He is the executive director of the Grolier Club in New York. He has a very impressive background, and it was difficult for me to squash down all that he's done into the next two chunks. So let me just tell you that Declan's impressive background includes his work at the New York Public Library, where he was director of special collections and exhibitions. While he was there, Declan inaugurated the library's first permanent collection of its important literary treasures. Some of you may well have seen the treasures exhibition there. It's absolutely fabulous and huge. Declan was also responsible for the acquisition of many major archival collections while he was there, such as the papers of Joan Didion in 2023. Declan was prior to that at the Morgan Library and Museum. He was head of the Department of Literary and Historical Manuscripts. While he was there, he curated many exhibitions, very important, on Milton, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Abraham Lincoln, Henry James, Winston Churchill, Ernest Hemingway, and J.D. Salinger. And that's only a start of what he did. That's the short list. Declan studied English literature at Royal Holloway College at University of London and was awarded a PhD on the early plays of William Butler Yeats from the Institute of English Studies, also at the University of London. Declan's essays have appeared in scholarly monographs and journals, and he has regularly lectured on literary topics, manuscripts, rare books, and bibliography. He currently serves on the board of managers of the Lewis Waffle Library at Yale University. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Declan Kiely to our abode this evening. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Okay, can you hear me? Excellent, great, thank you. It's on setting B, plan B, I guess, but this is plan A. Thank you, Chris, for that splendid introduction. I'm deeply moved and honored to be here. Thank you, John, also for inviting me this evening. It's wonderful to be back here in California. I'd also like to thank Kevin for all of your care that you've taken with the logistics for this evening. And if you'll allow me a maritime compliment, in the short time I've been on your new premises at your new premises this evening, I can tell that you run a tight ship here, my friends, and I congratulate you on it, and I'm very grateful to be here. I also feel like, as this is my first time back in California since the New York Public Library acquired the Joan Didion archive, that I probably should make some kind of public apology for transplanting a collection, an archive that probably should have been here in California over to the East Coast. I hope that one day you'll forgive us for that. Each morning, my commute to the Grolier Club takes me on the 4 train, known as the Lexington Avenue Express. After I alight at 59th Street, the train continues to its terminus at Woodlawn in the Bronx. Woodlawn Cemetery is the final resting place of that most well-traveled figure in 19th century American literature, Herman Melville, who died on September 28, 1891. "In my end is my beginning," T.S. Eliot wrote in 4 quartets, and thus the end is where we start from. I begin this talk about illustrated editions of Moby-Dick with a visit to Melville's burial place, memorialized in Hart Crane's 1926 poem titled At Melville's Tomb, which goes like this. "Often beneath the wave, wide from this ledge, the dice of drowned men's bones he saw bequeath an embassy. Their numbers as he watched beat on the dusty shore and were obscured. And wrecks passed without sound of bells, the calyx of death's bounty, giving back a scattered chapter, livid hieroglyph, the portent wound in corridors of shells. Then in the circuit calm of one vast coil, its lashings charmed and malice reconciled. Frosted eyes there were, at lifted altars, and silent answers crept across the stars. Compass, quadrant, and sexton contrive no farther tides. High in the azure steeps, monody shall not wake the mariner. This fabulous shadow only the sea keeps." How should we interpret the iconography of Melville's tombstone? The simple inscription crowded at the base of the stone records only the author's name, date of birth, and date of death. Unusually for a writer, there is no epitaph, no "here lies one whose name was writ in water," no "cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." The lettering is scarcely visible, mostly hidden by the ivy ground cover over the grave, which creeps diagonally across the stone in carved relief. The most prominent feature is the highly polished, utterly blank white scroll, behind which a quill pen is laid aside. The quill functions, of course, as the classical symbol of authorship, but perhaps here the visual motif also records the fact that Melville continued to write with a quill long after these had become obsolete as writing instruments by the latter half of the 19th century. Or perhaps they evoke the mighty lines of epic self-exhortation from Moby-Dick: "Give me a condor's quill, give me Vesuvius crater for an inkstand." The gravestone has been an object of speculation since the revival of interest in Melville that began in the 1920s. I'll say more about that in due course. One visitor to the burial site wondered at the meaning of the stone, asking, is it a sign of a writer's disillusionment and apparent failure at his craft? Or is it a statement as large and somber as the great blank forehead of the white whale? I would argue that the blank scroll, whether intentional or not, invites the visitor to project any number of meanings onto it. It creates a space for and invites posthumous interpretations of the life and the work. It has the same openness to critical and visual interpretations as Moby-Dick, the eponymous sperm whale at the center of the quest narrative, and Moby-Dick, the text of the novel itself. And it may also be read as an ironic comment upon Melville's literary reputation at the time of his death in 1891. Given the now widely accepted status of Moby-Dick as one of the greatest works of fiction in the English language, it is difficult to believe that there was ever a time in the book's history when this was not universally recognized. And yet nobody would have been more astonished by the novel's elevation to the highest rank of the literary canon than Herman Melville himself. In 1890, the New York Times reported that Melville had slipped so far into obscurity that most of his contemporaries, even his fellow New Yorkers, had no idea that he was still alive. The article ran, "One of the best informed literary men in this country laughed recently at my statement that Herman Melville was my neighbor by only 2 city blocks. Nonsense," he said. "Why, Melville is dead these many years." Talk about literary fame. There's a sample of it. When Melville died the following year at the age of 72 at his home at 104 East 26th Street, his passing merited only scant attention in the newspaper of record. The barely 7-line notice even misspelled the title of his magnum opus, Moby, M-O-B-I-E. Perhaps even worse, another obituary referred to him as Hiram Melville. This was all a far cry from the attention, perhaps even notoriety, that Melville enjoyed in the mid-1840s, when his growing popularity following the publication of his first book, Typee, led to him becoming known as the man who lived with cannibals. After Typee, 1846, Melville published a series of novels in quick succession: Omoo, a narrative of adventures in the South Seas in 1847, Mardi, and a voyage thither in 1849, Redburn, his first voyage, 1849, White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, 1850, and then his 6th book, Moby-Dick, or The Whale, in 1851. He published his last novel, The Confidence Man, his Masquerade, subtitle, in 1857. Tracing the rise and fall of Melville's popularity in little over a decade is a case study in how an author finds or creates an audience for his work, and then rapidly outpaces the expectations of his contemporaries through the rapid expansion of his literary ambition and achievement. This is also, on the flip side, why lesser authors are accused of writing the same book over and over again. Moby-Dick would prove to be the major pivot of his literary career, a decisive break from what he considered the potboilers that he had previously published. The gestation of the novel can be traced back to at least 1841, when Melville was sailing aboard the whaling ship Acushnet in the Pacific and reading Owen Chase's narrative of the most extraordinary and distressing shipwreck of the whale ship Essex. In his own copy of Chase's book, Melville wrote, The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea and so close to the very latitude of the shipwreck had a surprising effect on me. The surprising effect was to stir his youthful imagination to begin to write Moby-Dick 9 years later at the age of only 30. Melville's manuscript of the novel does not survive, so it is difficult to trace his creative process, which can only be recapitulated by reference to some of the letters he wrote during that time period when he was drafting the novel, and commentary recorded by those close to him. According to the testimony of his wife, Elizabeth Shaw, the novel was written under difficult circumstances, leading to much speculation about the precise meaning. How circumspect or euphemistic was his widow being when she wrote this 9 years after her husband's death? Perhaps she was recalling the material or financial circumstances of the winter and spring of 1850, when Melville began writing the novel in Manhattan, in a household that included his wife, mother, 4 unmarried sisters, a married brother and his pregnant wife, plus 2 young children, plus an unrecorded number of domestic helpers. While residing with family members was far from unusual at that time, add in some financial instability, and I think that difficult circumstances adequately sums up the situation. And these conditions did not change over much when Melville moved his family to Pittsfield in Massachusetts for the summer in 1850, before making this relocation permanent when he bought Arrowhead and became a gentleman farmer. Melville began writing Moby-Dick in February 1850, soon after his return from London, and wrote and revised the novel over the next 18 months, finishing it in the summer of 1851. His comment on his work appears in, his first comment, I should say, appears in a letter that he wrote on May 1st, 1850, to Richard Henry Dana Jr., author of 2 Years Before the Mast. He said, "About the whaling voyage, I am halfway in the work. It will be a strange sort of a book, though, I fear. Blubber is blubber, you know, though you may get oil out of it. The poetry runs as hard as sap from a frozen maple tree. And to cook the thing up, one must needs throw in a little fancy, which from the nature of the thing must be ungainly as the gambols of the whales themselves. Yet I mean to give the truth of the thing, despite of this." In the summer of 1850, Everett Doykink told his brother in terms that suggest he had either read or heard the text read aloud to him, that Melville has a new book mostly done, a romantic, fanciful, and literal, and most enjoyable presentment of the whale fishery, something quite new. Melville wrote to his English publisher, Richard Bentley, "In the latter part of the coming autumn, I shall have ready a new work. The book is a romance of adventure founded upon certain wild legends in the southern whale fisheries, and illustrated by the author's own personal experience of 2 years and more as a harpooner. Should you be inclined to undertake the book, I think that it will be worth to you £200. It might be worth to you a larger sum, considering its great novelty, for I do not know that the subject treated has ever been worked up by a romancer, or indeed by any writer, in any adequate manner." Perhaps finding it impossible to complete his work at Arrowhead, he finished the final chapters of Moby-Dick in New York in the summer of 1851. In June 1851, he told Nathaniel Hawthorne, with a note of quiet desperation, "In a week or so, I go to New York to bury myself in a 3rd-story room and work and slave on my whale. That is the only way that I can finish it now. I'm so pulled hither and thither by circumstances." Melville's novel was first published in London on the 18th of October 1851 by Richard Bentley as The Whale. The book's title was changed for the American edition because Melville's brother Alan intercepted on behalf of the author, writing to the New York publisher Harper & Brothers, Melville is determined upon a new title. It is thought here that the new title shall be a better selling title. Thus it was published in New York on the 19th of November 1851 with its full title as we know it today, Moby-Dick or The Whale. In the month between the publication of the novel in London, this is the title page that you can see here, and it's the time that it was published in New York, the Melvilles welcomed the birth of their second son, Stanwix, whose memorial stone you may have seen to the left of Herman's in the photograph I showed earlier. As a local aside, Stanwix was found dead in a hotel room here in San Francisco in 1886, age 35. And I should just say at this moment that Melville and his family were, they had already lost their son Malcolm, most possibly through a suicide. And this has caused some biographers to question, whether there was some kind of depression, perhaps inherited. Bentley demanded that some of the more irreverent, profane, and overtly sexual passages of the novel be toned down or cut. And these changes were made in-house in London by an editor rather than Melville himself. As a result, the 3-volume British edition ended up being 2,000 words shorter than the American edition. And notoriously, Bentley omitted the novel's epilogue. That's going to prove to be very important to contemporary readers of the British version of the novel. You can see here the one volume of the 3 volumes. They're issued uniformly with a right whale, I think it is, on the spine rather than a sperm whale, and quite splendidly produced books they were. Although contemporary reviews of Moby-Dick were, to use the accepted euphemism, mixed, several were much more positive than the reviews that had greeted his more recent novel Mardy, published 2 years earlier. In London, the magazine John Bull was quick to compare Moby-Dick to Melville's previously published work and declared, "Of all the extraordinary books from the pen of Herman Melville, this is out and out the most extraordinary. Who would have looked for philosophy in Wales, or for poetry in blubber? Yet few books which professedly deal in metaphysics or claim the parentage of the Muses contain as much true philosophy and as much genuine poetry as the tale of the Pequod's whaling expedition." However, the reviewer warned readers that they must be prepared to hear much on board which grates upon civilized ears. Some heathenish and worse than heathenish talk is calculated to give even more serious offense. This feature of Herman Melville's new work we cannot but deeply regret. It is due to him to say that he has steered clear of much that was objectionable in some of his former tales, and it is all the greater pity that he should have defaced his pages by occasional thrusts against revealed religion, which add nothing to the interest of his story, and cannot but shock readers accustomed to a reverent treatment of whatever is associated with sacred subjects. Nevertheless, it was perceptive in recognizing that Melville succeeded in investing objects apparently the most unattractive with an absorbing fascination, which raised the whale far beyond the level of an ordinary book of fiction. It is not a mere tale of adventure, but a whole philosophy of life that it unfolds. The London Morning Advertiser on October 24th, 1851, was also positive in its assessment. To convey an adequate idea of a book of such various merits as this, which the author of Typean Omu has here placed before the reading public, is impossible in the scope of a review. High philosophy, liberal feeling, abstruse metaphysics, popularly phrased, soaring speculation, a style as many-colored as the theme, yet always good and often admirable, fertile fancy, ingenious construction, playful learning, and an unusual power of enchanting the interest and rising to the verge of the sublime without overpassing that narrow boundary which plunges the ambitious penman into the ridiculous. All these are possessed by Herman Melville and exemplified in these volumes. The critic Henry Chorley, however, writing in the London Athenaeum, was particularly severe in his judgment of both tale and teller, calling Moby-Dick an ill-compounded mixture of romance and matter of fact. The idea of a connected and collected story has obviously visited and abandoned its writer again and again, in the course of composition. The style of his tale is in places disfigured by mad rather than bad English, and its catastrophe is hastily, weakly, and obscurely managed. As I mentioned, the epilogue was dropped, most probably accidentally rather than deliberately, from Bentley's edition of The Whale. So this may account for some of the criticism of the British press concerning the novel's confusing and really unsatisfying ending if it lacks the epilogue. The conclusion of Chorley's review is utterly damning. He wrote, "We have little more to say in reprobation or in recommendation of this absurd book. Mr. Melville has to thank himself only if his horrors and his heroics are flung aside by the general reader as so much trash belonging to the worst school of bedlam literature, since he seems not so much unable to learn as disdainful of learning the craft of an artist." In his hometown, the novel was greeted warmly by the Morning Courier and New York Inquirer. They said, "No American writer is more sure at every reappearance of a more cheerful welcome than the author of Typee. This book has all the attractiveness of any of its predecessors. In truth, it possesses more of the witching interest. The author writes with the gusto of true genius, and it must be a torpid spirit indeed that is not enlivened with the raciness of his humor and the redolence of his imagination." The critic William Young wrote in the New York Albion in 1851, "Not only is there an immense amount of reliable information here before us," I think that's very important to remember, and I'll come on to speak more about that in a minute. An immense amount of reliable information here before us. The dramatis personae are all vivid sketches done in the author's best style. What they do and how they look is brought to one's perception with wondrous elaborateness of detail. And yet this minuteness does not spoil the broad outline of each. And notwithstanding criticism of incongruities of voice and character, Young observed, as many have since thought at times when reading it, there is nevertheless in it, as we have already hinted, abundant choice reading for those who can skip a page or two now and then, judiciously. In December 1851, Harper's New Monthly Magazine asserted that Moby-Dick, in point of richness and variety of incident, originality of conception, and splendor of description, surpasses any of the former productions of this highly successful author. On the negative side, the critics writing in the Southern Quarterly Review found the novel a monstrous bore filled with ravings, while for the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, Melville's morbid self-esteem, with all his insinuating licentiousness on display, had produced another of his increasingly exaggerated and increasingly dull books. 500 sets of the 3-volume British edition were printed in October 1851, many of which did not sell, leading to 2 remaindered editions with cancelled title pages bound in red cloth as 1 volume in 1852 and 1853. Incidentally, those rebound editions are much rarer today than the 3-volume British edition. Copies of that 3-volume British edition, if still in its original publisher's binding, which on the market is often very, very rare, are now among the most highly prized by collectors. At the Christie's sale of the Herman Melville collection of William Rees in 2022, this copy sold for $302,400. If rebound in a contemporary binding, it knocks about 40% off that kind of price range. The first print run of the American edition totaled 2,915 copies, of which 125 were review copies. Priced at a reasonable $1.50, approximately 1,500 copies of the book were sold in the first 2 weeks. So it started off very well, very healthy sales. But after that, and after those reviews that I just quoted from, sales slowed to fewer than 300 in the next year. In 1853, only 287 copies, in 1853, 287 copies were lost, many of them still unbound in a warehouse fire at the American publisher of Harper's Brothers. A second printing of 250 copies was issued in 1855, largely to make up for that lost stock, and a third printing of 253 copies in 1863. Remarkably, during Melville's lifetime, Moby-Dick sold only 3,180 copies, only half of the sales that he had succeeded with in Taipei, and the book went out of print in 1887, 4 years before he died. As a comparison, the 2,500 print run of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter sold out in a matter of days. And, for a more startling contrast, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 75,000 copies in the first 3 months immediately after its publication in 1852. But Everett Dykink was spot on in his immediate critical assessment. Moby-Dick truly was something quite new. In its willingness to experiment with conventional form and traditional narrative style, and in its eagerness to embrace and exploit generic instability, Moby-Dick may be seen as a proto-modernist novel. It is not coincidental that at a time when novelists began to produce polyphonic works of fiction, Joyce's Ulysses being the prime example, a new generation of readers and critics rediscovered Moby-Dick. 30 years after his death, Melville found a new and more appreciative audience for his work, shaped by the stylistic developments that had transformed readers' expectations and understanding of narrative fiction and poetry in the preceding decades. Hence its appeal to writers such as Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, and D.H. Lawrence, who in his studies in classic American literature in 1923 called Moby-Dick one of the strangest and most wonderful books in the world, an epic of the sea such as no man has equaled. It is a great book, a very great book, the greatest book of the sea ever written. It moves all in the soul. But how did Melville go from America's sea author to being acknowledged today as one of America's greatest authors? The Melville revival, as it has become known, has its roots in the late 1890s and the dawn of the new century, and according to the scholar Eric Aronoff, remains one of the most startling examples of canon reformation in American literary history. It gained momentum after the centenary of Melville's birth through the appearance of critical studies and the first book-length biography titled Herman Melville, Mariner and Mystic by Raymond Weaver in 1921. The first complete collected edition of Melville's works, which was issued in 16 volumes by the London publisher Constable between 1922 and 1924, and the discovery and publication of Melville's novella Billy Budd in 1924. As a brief aside, I should tell you that a few weeks ago at the Grolier Club, we opened the exhibition Melville's Billy Budd at 100 to mark the centenary of its publication. Curated by the great Melville collector William Palmer Johnston, this exhibition pays particular attention to illustrations, dust jackets, unique fine bindings for limited editions, and original artwork. The exhibition remains open until November 9th, and I hope that some of you may be in town in time to catch it. Purely in terms of exhibitions, Melville is deservedly having his moment this year. On June 1st, the Peabody Essex Museum opened Draw Me Ishmael, the book arts of Moby-Dick, curated by fellow Grolier Club member Dan Lipcan, the Anne C. Pingree director of Peabody's Phillips Library. Drawing almost entirely from the Phillips Library collection, this is, remarkably, the first exhibition to be solely focused on visual interpretations of Moby-Dick. In particular, illustrations, typography, binding designs, artist books, graphic novels, and physical structures such as pop-ups and miniature books. This superb, beautifully curated exhibition surveys the variety of approaches to visualizing the novel through the hundreds of editions in which Melville's work has appeared since 1851. Dan Lipcan invites exhibition visitors to, as he says, think non-traditionally and independently about the novel and appreciate the variety of artist imaginings and approaches to visualizing it anew. That exhibition runs until January the 4th, 2026, so you have lots of time in which to see it. And I strongly encourage all of you to visit the Peabody Essex Museum if you are visiting the East Coast. I'm deeply indebted to Dan Lipcan for generously sharing many of the images that we will see this evening. Literary critics of the 1920s persisted in believing Melville's work was more accessible to a coterie audience and less accessible to a general audience. For Raymond Weaver, Melville was essentially a mystic, a delver after hidden things, spiritual and material. I would argue that prior to and following the critical reappraisal of Melville's work in the 1920s, it was the publication of illustrated editions that helped fuel the Melville revival. By making the novel more accessible to a new, larger, and perhaps most importantly, a younger audience, these illustrated editions had a major impact on the way that Moby-Dick has been read and understood since then. Bill Rees, in his essay in the Gazette of the Grolier Club in 1992, went so far as to say that some illustrations are so powerful and beautiful that they have become a text of their own for modern readers of Moby-Dick. And it is impossible to say how the subtle subtext of added illustrations has altered perceptions of the original book. It is impossible to think of Charles Dickens, any of his fiction, I think, without their accompanying illustrations by Hablo K. Brown, George Cruikshank, and John Leach, to name only a few of them, to name a few of the artists that illustrated Dickens's work during his lifetime. And he was not alone. 19th century British and American publishers promoted novel sales with lavishly illustrated editions. In contrast, none of the lifetime editions of Melville's work were illustrated. Of course, Dickens's work stands on its own merits, unassailably so. But the illustrations published within the pages of his novels when they first appeared in monthly parts was, I think, an undoubted advantage in terms of their contemporary commercial success. One wonders if things might have been different for the reception of Moby-Dick if the novel had been illustrated at any point during Melville's life. After all, illustrations can convey a visual narrative and sense of wonder. And although there is no shortage of mystery and majesty in Moby-Dick, illustration does have the power to convey narrative in a more visceral and compelling way. As one of Moby-Dick's more recent illustrators has noted, Melville gives just enough information to guide the artist while leaving enough ambiguity for the artist to run free. Things began to change at the end of the 19th century when British and American publishers began issuing illustrated editions of Typee, Omoo, White Jacket, and latterly Moby-Dick, usually with a frontispiece and generally with only 4 full-page captioned images at intervals in the text. And this is one of the images. This is Queequeg and Ishmael talking to Elijah on the quayside here. This was one of 4 images. The American Publishers Company commissioned the first illustrated edition of Moby-Dick in 1896, 5 years after Melville's death. The illustrator Augustus Burnham Shute, who did this illustration, had mostly prior to that made his name as a newspaper illustrator before, and also a book illustrator. But this was a kind of major turn in his career. This book proved so popular that the plates of this edition passed through several publishing companies over the following decades. And it continued to be published, versions of it continued to be printed from the 1896 plates until at least 1950. So it had this remarkable over half-century life cycle. As further evidence for the surge of interest in the novel during the Melville revival, it is recorded that in the 2.5 years between August 1919 and February 1922, L.C. Page and Company of Boston printed no fewer than 5 impressions of this illustrated edition, and there were 6 more impressions before 1950. In 1899, Scribner's published what would be the second illustrated edition of Moby-Dick for the first color. Actually, no, I think we've skipped over. Ben, would you go back one? The second illustrated edition was this one with images by Isaac Walton Tabor. And like Shute, he also made 4 plates for the book. This actually continued to be printed right up until 1923. So again, these books were, in the market for over 25 years. From 1922, the year of Constable's collected edition of Melville's works, until 1930, there were no fewer than 12 new editions of Moby-Dick, of which half contained illustrations. The abrupt rise in the production of these editions being a further reflection of the so-called Melville revival. Next slide, please. 1822 saw the first edition of Moby-Dick with, 1922 saw the first edition of Moby-Dick with color illustrations, published in New York by Dodd, Mead, and the following year in London by Hodder and Stoughton. The illustrator, named Mead Schaefer, produced 12 color illustrations for this book. And again, this proved to be commercially successful, and there were 6 more impressions of this edition over the following 30 years. As you can see, Schaefer's illustrations present the narrative more in terms of a sea adventure story, and contrast sharply with the more famous illustrated editions that would follow in the 1930s and beyond. And I think one of the reasons for Schaefer's illustrations is that they're sort of skewed more towards Melville's earlier work, Typee in particular, and the South Sea settings. In 1924, the Philadelphia publisher George W. Jacobs printed an edition with 6 illustrations by Charles O. Godin, and in 1925, Albert and Charles Boney in New York published an edition with 12 woodcuts by Howard Simon. This was reprinted again in 1933 with illustrations by Raymond Bishop. In the same year, Grosset and Dunlap printed an edition that was profusely illustrated with scenes from the talking picture starring John Barrymore. And that's the next slide. And of course, by this point, cinema is creating a whole new audience for Melville's Moby-Dick. And rather like when classic books are turned into either TV series or movies now, the actors make their way onto the cover of even, the more conservative publishers, and they reissue sort of special tie-in books. And that's an early instance of that right here. It is a testimony to Melville's genius that Moby-Dick has inspired so many dynamic and creative reactions to his characters and stories. Further editions in the late 1920s were illustrated by artists such as Edward S. Annison and John D. Whiting. And to fast forward a couple of decades, by 1851, the centennial of the novel's first publication, Moby-Dick had appeared in a total of 28 editions, and 13 of those editions had been illustrated. So nearly 50% of the editions that came out in those years were illustrated, which I think is quite remarkable. If it seems that the steady rise in popularity of illustrated editions was leading toward an apotheosis, that moment arrived in 1930 with the publication of the Lakeside Press edition, illustrated by Rockwell Kent. This elegant 3-volume edition, limited to 1,000 copies, was issued in an aluminum slipcase. It is sometimes referred to by some less reverent book dealers as Moby-Dick in a can. Despite its high cost, it was priced at $70 in 1930. The entire set sold out before it was even released for sale. When Lakeside Press hired Rockwell to illustrate Moby-Dick, and this is the cover design of the first of the 3 volumes, they only differ in that there's the Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3 at the top. It looks like an upside down wine glass with the wine spilling out underneath it to some eyes. What we're actually looking at here is the ocean and the back of the whale and a spout. And it's, I think, incredibly misleading in terms of the kind of illustrations that you get once you open the book. It's so spare, it's sort of redolent of very early art. It's a sort of wonderfully minimalist compared to the richness of the illustrations that the book contains. But when the Lakeside Press hired Rockwell Kent to illustrate Moby-Dick, he was already a recognized painter, engraver, and draftsman. He was also, in several respects, an ideal illustrator for the novel. Like Melville, Kent had an independent, skeptical mind and was also a restless traveler. He was an experienced sailor, visiting remote parts of the world, including Alaska and Tierra del Fuego. Kent might well have claimed an affinity with Ishmael, who declares in the opening chapters that "I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous shores." By character, temperament, and experience, he was uniquely qualified to comprehend and respond sensitively to the complexity of Melville's ideas and symbols, to recognize the nuances, multiple layers, and the text's dramatic, comedic, historical, mystical, and philosophical and scientific possibilities. During the time he was working on his stark, heroic illustrations, Kent was shipwrecked in Greenland, where he had the opportunity to witness Inuits cutting up whales and using it for food. And he subsequently incorporated this experience into his pictorial work. In total, he spent 4 years engaged in making the 280 ink drawings, during which he said, Moby-Dick constantly in mind. No other artist has created so many or such a rich variety of images for the novel. It is also fair to say that no other artist was so closely involved with the entire production. Kent chose the paper, designed the layout of the book, consulted on the typeface and the binding. And, by the way, the aluminum slipcase was his idea. Dan Burne-Jones, Rockwell Kent's bibliographer, wrote this assessment. I'm just going to show a selection of images from the Rockwell Kent edition. This is a headpiece to a chapter. Each chapter has a headpiece, a tailpiece, and in some cases, illustrations interspersed with the text. And so the book really flows absolutely beautifully. Jones said this: "At the confluence of the rivers," and I think this is an absolutely beautiful statement about this particular work. "At the confluence of the rivers of thought, there always seems to be a meeting of minds and talents, where the fine arts of writing, illustrating, and printing are joined. That masterpiece known as the perfect book is born. To produce a masterwork presupposes conditions of high mental and artistic capabilities. These are the components of the mystical and visionary forces which combine to produce a perfect book. Such a book is the Lakeside Press edition of Moby-Dick, the magnum opus of Herman Melville." Many of Kent's illustrations have become iconic. William Faulkner, who regarded Moby-Dick as the greatest novel in all American literature, purchased directly from Rockwell Kent an original drawing of Ahab standing on the deck of the Pequod. It's this one, I think, and kept this illustration above his writing desk for the rest of his lifetime. In this image, and this is one of my favorites, the whale lies beneath the surface of the ocean, as Elizabeth Schultz brilliantly puts it, as ominous as a nuclear submarine. I think you really feel that there. I've also got a theory, but just go back a second. I've also got a theory that this illustration lies behind the original cover art for the book Jaws, where he's directly shooting upwards. And of course, there are many, many images of whales breaching in Rockwell Kent. But I think the sort of ominous feel of this one with the boat instead of the swimmer, it's got to be, I think, an homage to Rockwell Kent. Next image. In this drawing, and the original drawing for this is at the New York Public Library in the Spencer collection, and we love it so much we actually put it in the Treasures book that we produced 3 years ago. In this drawing, the breaching whale appears to leave the ocean almost entirely, becoming one with the starry firmament. This is an artistic vision, I think, entirely in tune with Melville's own mystical vision. If Melville had lived to see this, I think he would have absolutely gloried in it. There's one illustration in the book, however, that really puzzles me, and it's the female figurehead shown here. In all of Melville's voluminous descriptive details of the Pequod, he never mentions a figurehead. And for those of you who know the novel well, there's so much saturation of detail about the ship that they're sailing on that it's hard to believe he left anything out. It's all in there. But he never refers to the Pequod having a figurehead. I have a suspicion that Melville's omission in the text is deliberate. It's a clue, given that figureheads of two other ships are referred to over the course of the narrative. As you probably know, the superstition of among sailors of that time period was that a semi-naked female form was believed to calm storms at sea, and that's why they're often underneath the bowsprits of ocean vessels. A ship without any figurehead at all was considered a doomed vessel. So why does Kent depict this one? It doesn't exist in the novel. I can't answer that question. I'd be curious to know if you have any thoughts about that later. It's quite anomalous. It's the only thing I found that Rockwell Kent depicts that actually isn't referred to in the text. In 1930, Random House reset the text and published a single volume trade edition with the same illustrations and text as the Lakeside Press edition, but in a smaller format. And the London publisher Castle also printed a trade edition for the British market the same year. A total of 69,000 copies of this trade edition were sold over the next 7 years, and another 25,500 in a deluxe version printed in 1937. So compare those numbers, these huge numbers of illustrated editions, with the really paltry, 3,000 odd copies of Moby-Dick that sold over the entire lifetime of Melville after its publication in 40 years. So these numbers are just remarkable, I think. Hence, forceful images became the best known and most immediately recognizable illustrations for Moby-Dick. And it's not surprising that for the Armed Services edition published in 1944, an adaptation of Kent's Ahab was chosen for the front cover. And I apologize, I don't actually have an image of that for you this evening. Kent's illustrations have been described as powerful and lasting depictions that cast a long shadow culturally and artistically. A prominent example of this is seen in John Huston's decision to cast Austrian Count Friedrich von Ledebur as Queequeg because, quote, he looked very much like Queequeg, according to, so he looked very much like Rockwell Kent's illustration of Queequeg. And you saw him earlier in the course of shaving with the sharp edge of a harpoon. Apparently that's when Huston saw Ledebur, he said, that's it, that's my man, that's who I want to have play the role. I think it's also interesting that when Random House produced this trade edition, you see the title stack there, illustrated by Rockwell Kent. The spine has the same information. What's entirely missing is the name Herman Melville. It doesn't appear on the Random House edition at all, which I think is also quite anomalous. The Random House editions of Moby-Dick with Kent's illustrations led also to multiple translations of the novel, beginning with a Czech edition in 1933. Leland Phelps lists 25 editions and reprints of Moby-Dick with Kent's illustrations, including those in Bengali, Bulgarian, Chinese, French, Hebrew, Japanese, and even Urdu. Kent's illustrations for the Soviet editions of Moby-Dick were especially cherished. You can see here, this is the book with the wrapper removed. And again, no mention of Melville, but just the title, wonderfully, so almost half at the top with the illustration below. The single volume modern library edition of Moby-Dick with 270, there were 10 less illustrations in the trade edition, remains in print to this day. And according to Thomas Tansel, is widely regarded as the most elaborate physical presentation which has been accorded to Moby-Dick, and one of the finest examples of bookmaking to be found among all the editions of Melville's works. Notably, Melville's name appears, as I said, nowhere on the cover, not in the silver stamped binding of the Random House edition, only the name of the illustrator. As Dan Lipkan notes, Rockwell Kent transformed how readers experienced Moby-Dick. The ubiquity of Kent's design is underscored here in this 4-volume miniature book edition, which is in the Peabody Essex exhibition, which I think is quite wonderful. The pencils there, obviously, for scale. And this is the entire novel, published at probably microscopic point size, but replicating the Kent design. Following the centennial in 1951, There were a further 28 editions of Moby-Dick over the next quarter century, of which notably only 7 were illustrated. After Kent's triumphant edition and its mass market circulation, publishers must have quite reasonably asked themselves the very real question from a commercial perspective: why bother to create new illustrations? So it had this perhaps slightly chilling effect on new creative interpretations of the work because of its sort of level of market saturation. However, it's worth mentioning that there were some notable elaborate illustrated editions in the mid-1970s. The Folio Society, and you can see the cover here, that uses Rockwell Kent's very famous image that I showed the drawing of earlier. And the Franklin Library with illustrations by Ronald Keller in 1974. And in 1975, the Artists Limited Edition Club presented this with 13 fabulously vibrant illustrations by Leroy Neiman. I think these are just so different from everything else. The sort of energy that these illustrations convey, very similar to the mighty energies that Melville writes about in his book. So whilst they can seem shockingly, dissimilar to the line drawings and so forth, I have a high regard for Leroy Neiman's work, and it's a wonderful, wonderful edition. Quite glorious and very, very 1970s, I feel, as well. And next slide, I think. That edition, by the way, with Leroy Neiman's artwork, also had a preface written by no other than Jacques-Yves Cousteau, the famous naturalist and popularizer of the ocean and early ecologist. And the cover of that book is also featured on the rack card for tonight's talk. In 1973, in New York, the Red Angel Press published 100 copies of Cytology, a systemized exhibition of the whale in his broad genera, natural history excerpts from Moby-Dick, which was illustrated by Ronald Keller. And this is the spine of the Grolier Club's copy. It's a really beautiful publication, beautifully bound. What's interesting to me about this is that it is only chapter 32 of the novel, which is the one that most people skip because it's the one where you get so much natural history, but it's also the one where Melville talks about whale sizes in terms of the volume sizes of books, duodecimo, octavo, and so forth, folio, and so it's quite wonderful. There are some other photographs from inside, I think, as well. So the text you see is printed around Keller's wonderful gatefold out pages, which are, again, I don't know of any other illustrated edition that goes to this kind of length, but probably something that you could do better in a book of just one excerpted chapter rather than the whole thing. Other artists who created, and this is another part of the Keller edition, other artists who created illustrations and visual interpretations of Moby-Dick include Robert Shore in 1962 and Warren Chappell in 1976. And incidentally, the first comic book adaptation of Moby-Dick appeared in 1942 in the Classic Comics Library, published in New York by Gilbertson, with illustrations by Louis Zansky. By 1966, Gilbertson's comic book versions of Moby-Dick had sold over 3 million copies. So I think that's very telling that for a youth audience, the first experience of this great work of literature probably came for very many people in their youth through the medium of comic. Finally, I want to turn to a masterpiece of modern bookmaking that has been acclaimed by the Grolier Club as one of the 100 most beautiful books of the 20th century. And this is where I think I come to San Francisco to pay homage to the great Arion Press. This, of course, is the Arion Press edition of Moby-Dick, designed by Andrew Hoyam, who I was delighted to see here earlier this evening, and published here in 1979. Since its inception in 1974 as many, perhaps most of you will know, and absolutely now preaching to the choir here. The Arion Press has published deluxe editions, over 100 deluxe editions, limited editions that are breathtaking in their scope and in their artistry. Michael Kimmerman, writing in the New York Times, declared that the Arion Press produces some of the most beautiful limited edition hand-printed books in the world. And I would heartily concur with that. And for me, the Arion Press Moby-Dick, limited to 265 copies, marks its apogee. In Moby-Dick, Melville wrote that to produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. This is a mighty book. Its physical proportions, that's my hand, and it's not that small, you know. So just for scale, so it shows you the scale of this book. It's absolutely wonderful. This is the New York Public Library's copy. This is a mighty book, as I say. Its physical proportions and materials perfectly incorporating the magnitude of Melville's theme. Measuring 15 inches by 10 inches, the book is bound in full blue Morocco goatskin leather. And the spine is stamped in silver and titled, silver titling, and issued, as you can see, in this beautiful, rich blue, full blue Moroccan goatskin leather. And it was issued in a blue slipcase with a paper spine label. It's printed in black and blue ink on dampened Bartram green paper that was handmade especially for this edition at Hale Mill in Kent, in England. And the paper color is a very light blue color, really to evoke the ocean. And I think every 4 or 8 pages, there is in the bottom corner a watermark of a sperm whale, which as you move the page, you can see it evanescently appear through as the light, translucent light, moves through it. The materials, I think, of this book combine to make it what I think of as a handsome edifice of a book. That perfectly befits what Melville called the high and mighty business of whaling, and the great sperm whale, this high and mighty godlike dignity. And this book for me really has that. This is Mr. Hoyam with the type cases here, as you can see. The type was hand set in metal type using Gaudi Modern for the main body of the text. The original printing was cast by Mackenzie and Harris on their Thompson typecaster. And Arion Press had sufficient type to set, I think, approximately 36 pages at a time, after which the text, all of the type was redistributed and then used again for the next succeeding pages of the book, which explains why it took over a year to print it. Frederick Gaudi's typeface has a pleasingly rustic appearance, ideal for a 19th century narrative, and I think it partners perfectly with the engraved illustrations. The text body typeface is complemented by a set of large capitals, and you can see the very first one here, this capital C, that were specially designed for the initial capitals that begin each of the book's 135 chapters and for titling purposes. This stately typeface, designed by Charles Bigelow and Chris Holmes, is aptly named Leviathan. The ample margins of each page and its typographic proportions are perfect. With around 65 to 70 characters per line, there's very little eye fatigue, even after extensive reading. Indeed, with its 18-point Gaudi Modern type, it's a book that can be read easily without reading glasses. Commencing in March 1978 and completed in May 1979, the book took over a year to print. William Everson has praised it as a feat of craftsmanship unexcelled in modern printing. Barry Moser, recognized as the foremost printmaker and engraver working today, illustrated the text with 100 intricate boxwood engravings that present specific characters, that depict tools of whaling, the ship, whaling activities, stripping the blubber, that kind of thing, aspects of the whale's, various parts here, the flukes. This is one of my favorite. I love the way that Mr. Moser, captures the sea, the splintering of the crashing whale as it disappears under the wave there. It's quite remarkable, the sense of movement that he captures. And as I say, the images were meant to serve as informative depictions of whaling. You see here the various whales, starting with the sperm whale at the top, and the whaling industry, rather than individual characters or scenes or incidents in the novel. So you don't get the same kind of dramatic scene depiction that you get in Rockwell Kent. And of course, that's very, very deliberate to set it apart from that great 1930 production. Prior to embarking on his work, Barry Moser extensively researched whaling at maritime museums in New England and here in San Francisco. In 1981, the University of California Press collaborated with Andrew Hoyam to produce an offset printed trade edition of the Arion Press Moby-Dick. And this reprint edition, although reduced in scale, 10 inches tall by 7 inches, compared to the original's 15 by 10, retains much of the beauty of the original, and copies are widely available to readers in hardback and paperback. There was also a deluxe edition, I think of 750 copies, that came out, I think, in 1982, and that's in itself become a collector's item. In his note on the California edition, John D. Hart, who was then director of the Bancroft Library, described the Arion Press edition as the most majestic presentation of America's foremost monumental novel. So I hope that we've reached, actually, before I go on, just go back one. This is the only full page illustration that appears in the book, and it appears exactly halfway through the book. Just when you turn the page and get to this point, you almost sort of step back and gasp, and it's just the most fantastic print when you see it at full size. I hope that we've reached a sufficiently advanced stage of our evening together to permit a rather embarrassing personal confession. When I first attempted to read Moby-Dick in my teens, I gave up after only a few chapters, and the paperback Penguin Classics editions went back on the shelf. A decade later, I packed it for a transatlantic sea crossing and figured that a week-long voyage would provide ample time for me to read it this time around. Again, failure. I think I got to maybe chapter 32 on that second attempt. It was only in my mid-30s when I bought a copy of the University of California Press edition of Moby-Dick that I not only read the entire novel, but experienced it in a completely different and more profound way. It probably didn't hurt that I read some chapters on the beach in Wellfleet, Cape Cod, occasionally looking up and seeing the spouts of humpback whales and fin whales not too far offshore. But I would posit that it was Moser's illustrations that invited and produced a more engaging encounter with Melville's text. And so last year, in the spirit of scientific inquiry, I reread the Arion Press, University of California Press edition again over the course of several weeks. And as soon as I finished it, I reread Moby-Dick immediately in one of the more recent deluxe editions printed by Penguin Classics. And I can tell you that it was a richer and more complex experience to read the illustrated edition of Moby-Dick than the unillustrated one. Thank you very much.
I too am a failed early reader of Moby-Dick. But it's never too late.
There's
No
shame.
No shame, no shame. We do have time for some questions. So if there are any questions here in the club rooms, John.
I hope, is Andrew still with us?
He's not.
He's not, no.
Okay, I have a memory hustling from Roxford. And I read the book when I was a teenager, stayed home from school in Marin County and read it. And I don't know, it's still a very strange book, but it was amazing. I've always kind of liked the Confidence Man. Andrew, I think, spoke one time, he's here to say, perhaps it's been published. In talking about the Barry Moser, he said that Mosher used the most advanced, he deliberately found the material of the most, the technology was being used in the 1850s. And he said that at that point, the technology of whaling, 49, 50, where it was Pitch HD. Are you aware of any remark like that that Andrew has made? Because it was a Mosher decision to do this. And of course, this is a very interesting thing. It's not the cinema. You can almost think of the Rockwell Kent as a cinema, continuity and tail pieces.
Yes.
And this is something very different. So of course, it was an incredibly wonderful. Have you ever heard that remark?
I haven't heard that remark, no. But Barry Moser is going to be visiting the Grolier Club in a few weeks. And so I'm going to ask him because I want to know myself. But it sounds right, doesn't it? It sounds exactly appropriate for this book that he would have gone back and sought out the most historically accurate materials
And it was,
to
he
work
said
from.
it was changing at that time.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
was a new technology that was coming in, whatever that amounted to. It was not just a harpoon and something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he did do a tremendous amount of research for several years before he undertook to do the illustrations for this book. And like with Rockwell Kent, he spent years of his life working on these.
Any other questions here in the club rooms? Okay, Greg first.
Sorry,
We'll go to Chris.
after, in the last few decades of his life, he wasn't publishing books. What was his source of income? Was he able to?
He became a customs officer in New York, and so which I think is, to me, is quite funny because the book begins with talking about how everybody is in New York flocks to the margins, to the sides where they can see the river and look out at the ocean from the Battery and so on. And it's a sort of natural progression, I guess, having spent his early years at sea, for him to become an inspector. So he was on and off ships, off the dotting the New York piers all the time, and that's how he earned his living right up until a couple of years before he died. So he worked beyond retirement age, and in those years, rather like Thomas Hardy, who after Jude the Obscure stopped publishing novels, though for different reasons, he turned to poetry and issued his poetry in small, very, very small numbers. I mean, we're talking about copies of only 25 in some cases. So these are incredibly highly prized by collectors. And you can see some of those. John Marr in particular, you can see in the Grolier Club exhibition that's on right now. But he certainly didn't make any money from poetry. He also is a record holder. Not only has he written one of the longest novels in American literature, but he also wrote an 11,000 line poem called Clarel, which is his, going head to head with John Milton in Paradise Lost. And obviously, Paradise Lost, the Bible, Shakespeare, these are all deep inspirations for Moby-Dick. And that found its outlet in Clarel, which was a sort of poetic account of visits to the Holy Land that Melville actually made. So he continued to write very much from an autobiographical, inspiration in all of his work.
Chris.
Are you aware of any other artist books that use that cetology chapter to play with book format?
That's the only one that I came across when I was, putting this talk together. It's in the Peabody Essex exhibition, but there are lots of formats that have playfully played with Melville's text. And I knew that I wouldn't have time to show you these this evening, so I strongly encourage you to go online and look at the online exhibition for Draw Me Ishmael, because you can see some of those. And the children's pop-up books are really wonderful. I love those. And there are several of those in the exhibition. There's also a Peep Show, but that's the only one that I know takes a single chapter and uses, things like gatefolds, that kind of thing.
I'm talking about the book format as the folds of the book. So
Right. Yeah.
For this class and that whole idea.
Oh, in terms of scale, no, it's mostly artists who have, moved away from the codex format, and it's sort of page, folded pages. And again, they're in the exhibition. I do have images, but I don't have them as part of my PowerPoint this evening.
One more question here, and then I'm gonna.
Sure, actually, one is a comment. Actually, the Arian Press put out a lovely edition of the Melville poems.
Yes, it
Using
is.
the paper that they have.
The
with
same
Joker.
paper. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yes.
My other question is, are there any, since the Arian Press edition, any editions that have come out illustrated that you would recognize or point out to us
So.
in the 30 years or whatever?
So the ones that I really like are the children's editions, but they're of course almost always abridged. But Patrick Benson a few years ago did an absolutely wonderful book. And what I think is interesting about the children's edition is that they pick up on parts of the text that other illustrators leave out. So they're not afraid to show the shrunken heads that Queequeg is carrying around like, onions. They'll go into territory that perhaps, I won't say conservative illustrators, I don't think Rockwell Kent or Barry Moser are, but they're willing to sort of, indulge more of the fantastic that is in the novel. And there's a lot that is fantastic in the old sense in this book. And so I think the children's editions are really wonderful at depicting that and actually sort of really bring the character, and of course their color and so forth. So that's the one I would recommend, Patrick Benson. That's the one I read to him and his brother when they were little.
There is one question on Zoom. There's a couple here that I'll have to send you
Sure.
afterwards because we're past the top of the hour, but this one I thought would be maybe a simple answer. Do you have a favorite Melville biography?
I guess Herschel Parker is the definitive one that I would go to more often than not. But if you wanted to have a delightful reintroduction for some people, or introduction if Melville's biography is not too familiar with you, there was a novel published last year called Day's Work, and it was by a husband and wife couple, a novelist and a poet. And it's a I guess generically you would call it a COVID novel, because it takes place, what minimal plot there is takes place in the pandemic. But it's really a meditation on Melville's life and work, and in particular Moby-Dick. And I strongly recommend that to you. Norton published that last year, and it's really, really good.
What's it called?
Another question.
It's called Day's Work.
Day's Work.
Yeah.
Are there other books on Melville? you would
D-A-Y
recommend?
apostrophe
Maybe not
S,
a-
Days Work,
No
or
apostrophe.
D-A-Z-E?
No, D-A-Y-S.
Okay,
And then work.
D-A-Y-S, okay,
Yeah.
but not apostrophe S, but.
No.
Days-
Other books on Melville that you would recommend? Maybe not.
Other books on Melville?
That's what it says.
Okay, yeah, I mean, well, there's so many to choose from. I would strongly recommend Ahab's Rolling Sea, which takes a naturalistic approach to the novel and is incredible. If you're already not overwhelmed by the whaling detail in Moby-Dick itself, this sort of up-to-date, scientific exposition is really fantastic, and I benefited a great deal from reading that one among the number of other books I read. Yeah.
And with that last question, we're going to wrap up. We're going to wrap up by first asking you to join me in thanking our presenter this evening, Declan Kiely. Also, join me in thanking our sponsors for tonight's presentation, John Windle and Chris Livingston. There's more. Join me in thanking our presenting partner for tonight's program, the American Trust for the British Library. Thank you. And join me in thanking you for joining us tonight, whether you joined us virtually or in the club rooms. Please join us for our next program on Monday, October 7th. It's titled Robinson Jeffers Tamar and Other Poems, a Centennial Appreciation. It's an in-person and virtual presentation by Tim Hunt, author, editor, and founding president of the Robinson Jeffers Association. You can register for that program or any programs online at bccbooks.org/programs. You could call me, you could email me. I'm Kevin@bccbooks.org, and we'll get you on the list. Thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.